of the trees regarding our gender identity and sexuality. When there's no place like home, empty air, an empty establishment. Friends with Dorothy, fighting for your civil rights. Out on the cruel streets tonight.
I'm joined today by my final guest on LGBTQ Life, and I am delighted to say this is a person who I have been waiting for years to have as a guest. It's the eminent Mary Dorcy. So Mary, welcome to the final edition. You couldn't be a more suitable guest.
Thank you. I'm trying to look eminent.
Yeah.
Raise myself a little higher in my chair.
Yeah,
so it's lovely to be here. I'm delighted to be a guest on a wonderful show.
We know there is dreadful hostilities going on around the world at the moment, and I gather you've got one of your poems that you'd like to share with the listeners. So if you could, the floor is yours, as we say.
Yes, well, you know, I've written many poems about war because unfortunately we're never safe from it, are we? So this one is called The Breath of History, and it's not actually about the physical fact of war, but it's about living in a world where it is dangerous. And if you're living in a world, a little corner of the world that's cozy, and you're reading the newspapers every day, The Breath of History. I'm not an ordinary woman. I wake in the morning. I have food to eat. No one has come in the night to steal my child, my lover. I am not an ordinary woman. A plum tree blossoms outside my window. The roses are heavy with dew. A blackbird sits on a branch and sings out her heart. I am not an ordinary woman. I live where I want. I sleep when I'm tired. I write the words I think. I can watch the sky and hear the sea. I am not an ordinary woman. No one has offered me life in exchange for another's. No one has beaten me until I fall. No one has burnt my skin or poisoned my lungs. I am not an ordinary woman. I know where my friends live. I have books to read. I was taught to read. I have clean water to drink. I know where my lover sleeps. She lies beside me. I hear her breathing. My life is not commonplace. At night, the air is as sweet as honeysuckle that grows along the river bank. The curlew cries from the marshes, high, far out. I am no ordinary woman. Everything I touch and see is astonishing and rare, privileged. Come celebrate each exceptional thing: water, food, sleep, the absence of pain, a night without fear, a morning without the return of the torturer, a child safe, a mother, a lover, a sister, chosen work. Our lives are not commonplace, any of us who read this. But who knows, tomorrow or the day after, I feel all about me the breath of history, pitiless and ordinary.
Beautifully written, Mary, and beautifully read.
Well, it expressed it so much. It's obviously an ongoing feeling and perception, because we're always at war, this world. And at particular times it's overpowering, and the sense of privilege to be out of it, you know, can be huge. The sense of guilt about it can be terrible. And I feel like that at the moment with the war that's raging in the borders of Israel and Palestine, and the news that's coming to us from there. And you ask yourself, when you're sitting in a cozy cafe sipping coffee, why not me?
It's funny you should say that, Mary, because last Friday, when we were all peaceful, I had a friend visiting me from Israel. You know, we've known each other for a few
Yes.
years. And she was saying to me, she loves Ireland. She comes here every 18 months at least.
Yes.
And she was saying one of the reasons why she loves Ireland is because it's so peaceful. You know,
Yes.
you're never hearing sirens, you're never running to shelters. And I'm not getting partisan about this. 24 hours later, the expression on her face was shattering because it had all, you know, it's exactly the
Yes.
point you're making. It went from
Yes.
one medium to another. Mhm.
Yes.
When was that written, Mary, as a matter of interest?
Quite some time ago. I'll have to check the date.
God,
But you know, we mustn't forget about the north of Ireland, and we've certainly had our share of wars and our war of dangers. But I think that it satisfies me to write a poem like that. 2001, I think it was written and published. It satisfies me to write a poem like that because to say I'm not an ordinary woman, and people, of course, assume that's because I'm gay, I'm not an ordinary woman. And they also tend to assume, and they certainly did when I was growing up, you know, in my 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, before marriage equality, they assumed that you were, you know, one of the unhappy of the world. And so it's very unexpected for a lifelong lesbian to say, I am not an ordinary woman, but for the reason that I'm so privileged.
Yeah, but a couple of things, Mary, I'm going to put to you. You were never going to be ordinary because when I saw you the first time, I was just awestruck because two things that always appeal to me in males, females, and whatever. One is courage, and the other is imagination, and you just oozed both. So, I'm, as I say, I'm in awe of your courage because I know that era, and it cannot have been easy.
It wasn't.
You transcended it.
Answer. Do you know, in a strange way, it gets harder as it goes on because I was so fierce then, and the others around me, Edmund Lynch, the late Edmund Lynch being one of them, and I hope we speak about him later. You know, that small group of us, we had such a fierce attitude to oppression. And we were all, or most of us, in love or about to be in love and carried along by that and by the tremendous fun we had, the collective fun. But in some ways, you know, and I thumbed my nose at the whole world, and my family were just aghast and shocked and didn't know what to make of it, but thought this is just another of Mary's phases, it'll probably pass, you know. So as the years went on and it didn't pass, and I went on writing and writing, or began to write scandalous stories and poems. I think, oddly, my siblings are very permissive. I was the youngest of five, and yet it has separated me from them. I think the writing about it and the openness about it has in some way put me in a special bracket. And I'm actually more conscious of that as I get older.
I would
But
never
my mother, I always bring my mother into it, so I might as well bring her in now. Than my mother, who was, you know, a God-fearing Catholic, not a craw-thumping type of Catholic. You know, she was always a thoughtful person. Her great saving grace, and for me, was that she was a tremendous reader. She had grown up in a family of readers, and my father was a reader. And so she learned about the world through books, and she knew that the world she lived in wasn't the universal world. And she actually knew about lesbians, so she wouldn't say or didn't know that word. But I remember when I was quite small, her saying to me, you know, Mary, there are women who it doesn't suit them to be married, and they would prefer to live with a woman, you know. And so she certainly knew couples like that. And there were quite a few that I knew, but I didn't realize there were lovers, elderly women who lived together all their lives. And the story then used to be that their husband died in the Second World War. That was common story. And that they took pity on one another and moved in together, you know. And what a lucky consolation that was.
Yeah, well, I have a friend whose family came from the northeast of England, and it was the fiancés died in the Second World War. So. Mary, I just want to go back to Edmund because you knew Edmund better than I did. I only recently, in the last, say, 10 years, got to know Edmund, and he was such a character. And he was, to me, he was a real pioneer. Sadly, he passed away from us about a week ago. What's your memories of Edmund?
Well, probably oddly, I'll start with the most recent, because we were thrown together at the last Pride and we were both to be marshals. And Edmund said he was traveling in the bus and I was to travel in the bus. And I thought that was the bus that it used to be, when you're up on the top and waving to people. Anyway, somehow through a whole mixture of things, I got lost in the crowd, and Edmund wasn't on that bus. He was on a single-decker bus with a lot of people who had a disability of one sort or another. But I had spent so much time running up and down the street looking for Edmund that I was exhausted, and I would have crawled onto any bus that passed. So I crawled onto that bus, and there was Edmund with his head down, a bit embarrassed, and I sat beside him and we had a great chat. And for the next few days, and I think a couple of days before that, leading up to Gay Pride, we met a couple of times and we had lovely conversations, really close, intimate conversations, when he told me a lot about his life, about his family, about where he was now in his life. And actually, we'd had similar conversations about when was it that we had the lovely greet 5 years ago, because we went to the Dáil, we were all invited to the Dáil to be given a public forgiveness, and lovely speeches from everybody about how glad they were that things had changed. And I was sitting with Edmund, and we were sharing jokes and stories from the past. Now he was David Norris's second in command. All those years, we met famously in Trinity, all of us. I'd never met him or heard of him. None of us knew each other. Even David wasn't known to us. So we got together on that night, so many strangers, I think it was 7 or 8. And I was with my girlfriend at the time, Irene Brady, and we just automatically began to plan changing Ireland and being a campaigning group. We knew there was such in America, and they were starting in England, so we really needed one. It was overdue, and we staged a little demonstration very soon in Grafton Street. And from the beginning, Edmund, I think, had the idea of legislative change. He wanted to change not attitudes and feelings, but legislation and structures. And he got together with Norris about that. And they very soon formed a group together and began campaigning, raising money with the intention, I think, almost from the start, to change the law, to decriminalize homosexuality, because for males that was such a pressure. Nothing really could happen for them until it was decriminalized.
It's interesting you should say that, because David always essentially claimed that he was the one that went for the legal strategy, which I commended, because when I was in Australia, they went for an economic strategy.
Yes.
But I'm very pleased that you're giving credit to Edmund for that, because often he doesn't get the credit for the amount of work he did. And clearly this was a major strategic policy.
Yeah, he was a powerhouse.
Mm-hmm.
He was an extraordinary person in that he was always head down, and leaning in under Norris's shoulder and very often prompting Norris, and he was the one who knew where all the documents were and where they're taking notes of this and writing this up and, suggesting the next thing. He was extraordinarily good at organization and structure. That was really his genius. And I don't think any of the rest of us had that, because Norris was the big thinker, and Norris was the public man, and Norris was the public face, with that tremendous ability, to draw the crowd and draw sympathy. They should have hated David Norris, but people loved him, In no time at all, they start saying, "Oh, I like this man. I don't have no time for homosexuals, of course, but I like this one, But Edmund was in the background. But I think without him, IGRM, as it was called, IGRM, the Irish Gay Rights Movement, I don't know that the law would have changed, or not until very much later. And also, he used all his RT contacts. A lot of people wouldn't know that. He was a cameraman, and he knew everybody in RT, and he was very well liked. and he could get around people in a very easy way, you know, and he made connections.
Yeah. My engagement initially with Edmund, he was a guest on this show many years ago, and we gelled because we both had this, shall we say, commitment to legacy. Edmund he was a great archivist, and I was at the time working for Tenny. And so I've got a lot of archive material on trans that other people don't have. And Edmund, we met about a week before he passed away, and he wanted to combine the two archives because we both understood legacy. Just on that point, Mary, how important do you think that commitment to legacy is?
Oh, I think it's tremendous. I think it's so important because, as you know, so much of what gay people and feminists and radicals, political radicals of all sorts, have got lost. And we just don't know about it. And we think we're inventing the wheel because if we don't have records, tangible records. I knew about gay people because I loved reading. And, you know, I mentioned this recently and people looked amazed because the people in the audience, because these were women who were writing, and one man that two men, in fact, Jean Genet, the French writer, and James Baldwin, the American writer, and Colette, the French writer, and Simone de Beauvoir, the French writer, you know, they all wrote about gay life, and they were writing about it in the 50s and 60s. But a lot of people didn't come across that until years and years later when they were maybe published by Virago. I mean, people in the English-speaking world. I was lucky to have a brother who was a tremendous reader, and he was at UCD doing history and politics and literature. And he used to keep me quiet when I was a 10-year-old. I used to go up to his room and lie on the bed because it was the only warm room. My mother allowed him a heater because he was studying. And I used to lie on the bed and he'd throw the books over his head like this and say, here, read that one, try that one. And he'd mark out paragraphs. And that was just, you know, that was just fun. Then I began to read them all the way through, not just the paragraphs that he marked. But if I hadn't had those people and read, you know, these wonderful, tremendously interesting and clever and moving accounts of their lives, I don't know if I would have come out. I would, you know, where was I coming to? I had a sense of what it was to be a woman in love with another woman and happy about it. I knew that existed. I didn't think it existed in Ireland. And I went to France and studied in France when I was 18 because I couldn't wait to get out of the place.
It's funny, the authors you mentioned, it brings me back to, that was like my father's latter day collection of works, you know. Previously he was big on Dickens and all of those things, always trying to encourage me. And then suddenly in came James Baldwin, in came Jean Genet, in came Gore Vidal, in came William Burroughs. And so that
yes, Gore Vidal.
Marvelous. That was my introduction as well, and because to me, gay in Ireland was sleazy priests and schoolmasters who were always, you know, that was, and I said that on the interview with Edmund, that put me off. It was only when I went abroad you saw things in different cultural light. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. Tell me, Mary, I mean, it was probably when you went to France that. You know, it's like a different door opens. Now, I first heard about lesbians from my uncle, who was my father's older brother. And because he used to make frocks for Dusty Springfield.
Oh.
I never knew what
wow. There's distinction for you.
Yeah, and I didn't know what a lesbian was, but I knew she was one of them.
Oh, I adored Dusty. I didn't have any idea when I adored her that she was lesbian, but that voice, oh.
It's still magnificent.
I count to 10.
Well,
did you grow up in Ireland?
She didn't know. Or maybe
no, did you?
Oh, I did, yes. I left here when I was about 21, you know, so in many respects, your experience and mine overlapped to the degree that at 21, I left here and didn't come back till I was in my mid-40s.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
I kept coming and going. I came back, you know, I'd go away for a year and come back and go away. And when I came back and discovered IGRM, not IGRM, sorry, the sexual liberation movement on that notorious night in Trinity, I had just come home from France. And, I've told this story over and over. I was walking on Grafton Street with my girlfriend. I had been living with a lovely man in France who was a tremendously good, interesting, sophisticated person. But I didn't want to marry. He wanted to marry. But I was absolutely certain I didn't want to marry, and I wasn't even sure why. But anyway, we were walking up Grafton Street, myself and my girlfriend, Irene Brady, and this poster was on the lamppost and just at the bottom of Grafton Street. And it said in big red letters, Sexual Liberation Movement meets tonight, Trinity. And I said to her, we're going. Mm-hmm. Just like that. I knew immediately. I'd never seen those words put together before. I mean, I had read Kate Millett and people like that, the beginning of the women's movement, but I hadn't read anything positive about gay or anything radical. And I knew immediately this was going to change my life. Just seeing that, I can still see them in my mind's eye, these big letters in red, Sexual Liberation Movement. That's definitely what we need.
Yeah. Was it different for women? Because, and I know it always invariably is, but my memory going back to the early 70s, and I say this to people, there were no gays in Ireland. There were just queers. What was the perception from a female perspective?
Oh, even worse. We didn't exist. There couldn't be anything as weird as two women. I mean, how could there be? What could they do in bed? Yeah. I mean, my sister is very sophisticated. She's older than me. And when she was being a bridge between my mother and I, my mother was being extremely kind about it, but bewildered. And that wasn't surprising because I had been considered boy mad. I had boyfriends all through my teens, and her big worry was that I'd get pregnant, before marriage. And this was a new shock to get used to. And I remember my sister saying to me one day, but Mary, you can't be surprised that she doesn't understand. I mean, she doesn't even know about the clitoris, how could she understand anything at all? And they were. That's how ignorant Irish women were,
Well, here's another couple of stories for you, Mary. I grew up in an area where just down from the Ballybock Bridge, and there was a woman across the road, and we just accepted her for what she was, that she was different. And she had very short hair, smoked cheroots.
Oh, yes.
Never saw her in a dress. She'd have epaulets. And to make it even better, she was a card-carrying Nazi. Now, I know that because
yes.
she went into her house and she had this big flag. Her name was Von Munch.
Okay.
I know. And then my next door neighbor who lived with her grandmother, her name was Frances Arthurs, or Frances Tobin, as we used to know her. And apparently when Catherine Hepburn was making The Lion in Winter here. I don't know if you remember that, the Peter O'Toole movie.
Sad to say I do.
Ran off with Catherine Hepburn.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
It was a colourful neighbourhood that I didn't even know about at the time, isn't it?
Yes. You see, it was, of course, it has to be always there. It always has been there. People had all sorts of covers up. I have one very moving story, which I won't tell now because it's too long. Yeah. It involves a neighbour who I always thought was extremely right-wing and had been lovely to me when I was a child and then turned against me when I came out, or I thought that she was. But so I won't go into those story now. I'm writing it actually. And it is an amazing story, but it typifies, the double lives, the complexity of people's double lives at that time. And how even gay people, even when we were out and looking for other gay people, we could be fooled by somebody's exterior, somebody who was playing a part to save their lives, to protect themselves from rape and God knows what. Worse.
And as you told the International Dublin Writers' Festival, they seem to have nothing better to think about than leading housewives astray.
Yes, exactly. Occasionally they were right. I won't name. I never mention names, but there were all sorts in the early days of the women's movement. And to our eternal credit, the women's movement, straight women, if there were such, in the women's movement, and gay women, and bisexual women, and no sexual women, all got on like a house on fire, and nobody worried about who was what, And there was a lot of crossing over boundaries and so on. But there is one lovely story about an au pair girl who fell in love with her, the housewife, and they came out and came to all the parties together. And they're both out ever since.
Good.
But that's just how it happened. People just discovered themselves when through a fluke almost.
So I think a lot of people wouldn't be surprised to hear that, people met up and organized in Trinity, because in those days it did have the reputation of Trinity queers, if you recall that insult. But where did people, particularly women, where did they go to socialize? Now I know people tell me about J.J. Smith's, but that was after I had left here.
That was later.
Pardon?
I actually don't know where they went. There were a couple of pubs. I mean, there wasn't such a thing as a gay pub. There was, for women. There were, a couple of places on Grafton Street that men went to. And I think a woman who was open, there weren't any openly gay women, but I mean, open to herself, might have possibly gone somewhere there, but probably not, because they'd be afraid to be spotted,
Yeah.
And the story I've told many times, and I won't mention the name, but when I went to before the SLM meeting, when I'd come home from Paris and I was desperately looking for, some spark of rebellion, not necessarily gay people, but revolution and open-mindedness and radicalism, And I went to the Irish women's, whatever we called ourselves, the first women's movement.
No.
And I had gone to a couple of meetings before, that Nell was famously in. And it was up in the Bagot Inn, in a room above the Bagot Inn. And they were all talking about marriage on the night and why marriage was so important, including Nell. And Nell was talking about how we'd all love to go up the aisle. Wouldn't we all love to walk up the aisle, And as far as I could see, nobody had any idea that I didn't know she was gay because she hadn't said so. And I thought, oh my God, the whole lot of them are heterosexual. There's not a gay woman between them. So I made an impassioned speech, and I said, is there nobody here, who doesn't dream of marriage? Is there nobody here at all who's gay or attracted to their own sex? And there was silence, terrible silence. I thought, oh, I've definitely come to the wrong place. But anyway, a woman pursued me down the street that night, and I was getting my bus outside Trinity. Just a coincidence, that happened to be where I was staying with my mother, because I'd just come back. And every time I came back from somewhere, I'd stay with my mother. So anyway, this woman came up to me, a woman I still know, a wonderful woman as it happens, and she just attacked me at the bus stop and said, how dare you come to our meeting and talk like that? She said, I've been with women all my adult life. And she said, I can go anywhere in Ireland. And she was absolutely passionate about this and furious with me. And she said, I'm a commercial traveler from my income. And she said, I can go to any hotel in Ireland and I check in with my girlfriend, and they just accept us as sisters. And she said, and you're going to ruin that for all of us. And she really meant that. You're going to ruin it for all of us.
Yeah.
And so that was an eye-opener for me. And obviously that is how people lived. Obviously, they invited people to their house, and they maybe went to a sympathetic pub, but maybe not even a pub that was known as somewhere that gay men met, because that might have outed them. And they couldn't afford to be outed. And there wouldn't have been more than, I don't know, 10. But there were many, many couples who lived together all their lives, and everybody just accepted them as sisters. And there must have been sophisticated people who knew they weren't sisters.
Yeah.
But it wasn't said.
Yeah. I've heard you speak publicly several times, Mary, and every time you've referred to your mother, and I think you've always referred to her very sympathetically, very supportively. How important was she to forming the character that is Mary Dorcy now?
Hugely. Everyone who was close to me knew my mother, and they all get enormously fond of her, usually fonder of her than they are of me. But I couldn't be the person I am without her, obviously. But part of why I talk about her all the time, and I know I talk about her far too much, it's because, you see, she doesn't mind me well, she's long gone now. She's been dead many years. But even when she was alive and suffering from her neighbours, the hostility of her neighbours, many of them, I've told all that story before, the parish priest turning his back on her, and letters to the Irish Times abusing me, and neighbours just cold shouldering her for years. And she withstood all that. She withstood extraordinary pressure. And there wasn't any other mother that she knew. In fact, there was another mother who went through something similar, but they didn't know each other. And I couldn't have done what I did in Ireland if she hadn't supported me. But part of the reason I talk about her is just because she's the only person I can name. Nobody else wants to be named. They all say to me now, Mary, if you're on television again or you're doing this, don't talk about me. Don't mention my name.
A bit like Nell and Nuala. No,
Yes, exactly.
the reason why I mentioned that is because I became who I am in spite of my mother. I could do nothing right. It was
Yes.
always society was right and I was wrong, and all
That's more common, obviously.
when you were listening to you, I was envious of all of that. Coming back to because we're running short of time with
Yes.
with the recordings, Mary. But coming back to it, poetry, was that always, shall we say, your métier, or did you try other like?
No, I've written 3 books of fiction, and it was a collection of short stories that I won the Rooney Prize for. And Biography of Desire is still a bestseller. And I'm writing fiction now. I've written a lot of fiction that I haven't published. So I'm back to fiction now and writing a novel. So poetry, I wrote them both when I was a child. I can't remember a time when I wasn't trying to write little poems and everybody just laughed at them, but I continued, And at night I shared a double bed with my sister and she would say, "No poems." As soon as I got into bed, I wasn't to be reciting any poems. So I also wrote short stories always, and I wrote an essay, every Sunday night you have to have an essay for Monday morning, and myself and one other girl competed for first prize always with the essay. So it was always my thing, English, and I read everything that came my way. I never said to myself, I'm going to be a writer, because that would have been something beyond the dreams of any arrogance, for a young Irish girl. Edna O'Brien, when I read about her, I was 15, and she had published her first book. And she was literally the first Irish Catholic woman to, be public in that way. And until then, and many of the great writers, Molly Keane and all the rest of them, Elizabeth Bowen, they were all Protestants and independently rich. And that was, I understood that's what you had to be if you're going to write, because, nobody made money from books at that time. Most people still don't. And they could withstand any sort of criticism because they were above the mob, But that wasn't going to be me. I think I've said my father died when I was 7, and my mother had a struggle to keep us all going. And I left home. We all felt the need to leave home as soon as we matured, to keep the weight off her. So I was just somebody who wrote all the time. But being a writer was a step too far. That came later.
Just before we go, Mary, I just want to ask you, because I've been the younger generation that would possibly be 2 generations below us. I keep saying to them, you really need to connect to what went before, because they take for granted the rights that you and I aspire to. How important do you think that intergenerational communication is? Because it would be a dreadful shame if people just took for granted what we had to fight for.
Oh, it's vital, isn't it? It's vital. How can anything be continued into another generation past our death if we don't manage to communicate with the contemporary young people? But it seems to be so often the way, because we didn't communicate with the generation above us. As I've said, I only knew them through their books, the few of them who wrote books, but they weren't free to come and say, listen, Mary, I'd love to talk to you about my emotional life. And it seems that each generation has to make their own mistakes, don't they? And very often you don't discover the pioneers and the people. Everybody thinks they're inventing the wheel. And then when they get to their middle 30s and they start hearing about people in the generation of us, and they think, God, isn't that amazing? I never heard of them. Oh, they did all this before, And that's the tragedy of human life. We all have to do it as if for the first time. And we have to come to an end now, I know, but I'd just like to say, with regard to the writing, that particular, intersection between discovering myself as, first of all, bisexual and then a lesbian. I knew I couldn't live a normal life. I wasn't going to be able to, live a quiet, respectable job. And I knew I wanted to write, but I hadn't thought I want to be a writer. But I quickly understood that the gay world needed a writer. And two feminists. I haven't had a chance to mention the women's movement because I was very intensely involved in that, both the first women's movement and then Irish Women United, which became famous. And there were some wonderfully, incredibly powerful women in that group who have gone on to great things and are the movers and shakers in Irish society, are behind most of the changes that have happened. And many of them were, passionate readers and writers. And one, Evelyn Conlon, she and I were chosen as representatives of the group, when going out to make speeches and so on, because we both had something like the gift of the gab. And she and I both had been writing all our lives, really. And we were talking about it one day, and we said, well, do you think you could ever think of writing a book? And she said, oh, I don't know. And I said, I don't know about myself. And then I said to her, but even if it's not a good book, it's a book that has to be written. And that really opened something for me, that I didn't have to write the perfect book, that it didn't have to be world-changing literature, but somebody had to tell the truth about our lives. So that was the spur. Even if we don't write it perfectly, it will be better to write it than not write it at all, much better. And she's gone on, we're both in Aestána together, and I think she's on probably her 10th book and has won many awards. Most distinguished writer, Evelyn Conlon. I don't often get a chance to reference her.
Mary, you're an inspirational speaker. You've left an incredible body of work. You've left a legacy of experiences for a generation to come. And you've just told us all that writing is cathartic. So I am delighted.
Yeah, cathartic and inspirational.
Indeed.
If it lasts, it's there. It's the one. It's where people can discover the private lives of others. People tell the truth in books. There's almost nowhere else people tell the truth, but they tell it in books. That's what I learned.
Yeah. Mary, I've waited a long time to speak with you. I am absolutely privileged to do so, and it has been a delight. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much. I've enjoyed it too, and I hope we're going to do it again.
Couldn't see the haunted forest for the trees, regarding our gender identity and sexuality. When there's no place like home, empty air, an empty establishment. Friends with Dorothy, fighting for your civil rights.